Well, here it is. It's May 5th, which is the day after May the 4th, which, is a special Star Wars day if you're the kind of nerd that I am. But it is also was a big day for Pulumi. It was PulumiUP. We launched a whole bunch of things. We have the new version of Pulumi, and I'm joined today on this special edition of PulumiVision with Pulumi CTO, with Luke Hoban. So, Luke, welcome to the PulumiVision.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. My first time being able to join you on PulumiVision. So
Yeah,
and a fun time to do it with the launches yesterday.
right. We got a lot to talk about too. So one of the things, just to sort of think through, and actually I'm going to surprise you with a question that you don't know is coming, because I meant to ask it like in the company Slack, but I forgot. So if we sort of look historically at Pulumi, over the years of the different versions, but so last April, we launched Pulumi 3.0, and yesterday launched the Pulumi IAC, or Universal IAC. Now, one of the things that came up, so last year when we did the launch of Pulumi 3.0, at Pulumi, we were all given a 3-day weekend because it was 3.0. And at the time, I told my son, and he said, does that mean when it's Pulumi 4.0, you'll have a 4-day weekend? And so now it being universal, I think that, I don't know what that means for our PTO. I guess we have unlimited PTO, so it's universal. Yeah. We already have it.
Well, at the time of between, we also decided to do an all-company week off in the middle of summer. So
okay, so that's the universal PTO, right? So we got it handled. But yeah, my son was like, "Well, that's great when you get to like version 6. At a point, you get the whole week off."
Strategy to encourage everyone to ship more often, right?
Yeah.
The more we ship, the more days off we get. But no, I think it's the team's obviously worked really hard over the last few months. So I think a lot of folks are taking days off today, tomorrow, next week, to sort of unwind after a lot of work to get to some cool releases yesterday.
I am definitely taking tomorrow off, so I'm getting my 3-day weekend. So let's talk about a couple of the things that there's a few. Actually, I think almost all of the things that got announced are bangers, right? Like they were big, but there's a few that are maybe not necessarily bigger, but maybe a little more attention getting. I mean, one of them is, support for Java as a language you can write your Pulumi programs in, which, previously you had all the .NET languages. Although I guess is Java, there's a Java.NET maybe.
There's conversion between all these things,
right? That's okay, but Python,
I think
yeah,
platform for sure.
So, and that's huge, right? Like Java is, it's been around for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, not just around for a minute, but been a huge part of the developer landscape for a long time, and still just like incredibly broad usage. One of the most used programming languages and runtime environments in the world, and clearly some big pockets of heavy usage in the cloud infrastructure kind of space. A lot of big kind of cloud companies using a lot of Java, and so no, it was one of the ones for us. It was one of these ones that was clearly a when, not if kind of thing from the very early days of Pulumi. We knew that we were going to support Java. It was just a matter of, when is that going to come in the sequence of new languages we bring on? And so it was really, I think it was great to ship it yesterday and add that support and be able to bring, one of the great things with Pulumi is when we add new languages, they sort of immediately get everything that Pulumi has, right? Sort of part of this universal infrastructure as code thing is, they get all of the different libraries we support, all the different cloud providers, all the different cloud architectures, all the different tooling and features like that. And so every new language we've added has sort of, when it becomes available, there's even more available on day one because Pulumi itself has gotten bigger and broader and richer in that time period. And so I think it's just really fun seeing now when we bring up a new language, just how much stuff is available to use, through that. And then plugging that into everything that's available in the Java ecosystem, the IDE tooling, the productivity tooling, the package management, the testing tools, everything that's available. Like it just has one of the richest sort of software engineering ecosystems. In some sense, the Java ecosystem was one of them that really pushed forward our notion of what software engineering at scale could look like and sort of redefined that back, 20 years ago or so. And a lot of those lessons have now been brought into other communities, but I think that the Java ecosystem really pushed the bar up a long way on that. And that's kind of, that whole trend is what Pulumi sits on top of. How do we take all of those things that were developed in these ecosystems and make them now available for cloud engineering development? So
yeah, that's what I was thinking when I said it was like, it's been around for a minute. It's like very mature, right? You know, and the ecosystem is mature, and there's a lot built around that. And that's one of the, you know, great things about, you know, writing, you know, having a general purpose programming language is what you write your infra code in is you get all this stuff for free.
Yep.
Right. You know, I mean, it's already there, and you can leverage that, both the lessons and just even the tooling. But then on the other side of that, so to speak, maybe not the other side, I don't put them at cross purposes, but we also, you know, Pulumi YAML, which was kind of a, you know, I think people might have been expecting that on April 1st, maybe, I don't know, but you know, but I don't think it's really as controversial as it might have seen at first.
Yeah, it's one it's never been a controversial idea to me per se, but it has been controversial, you know, to other folks, you know, folks, you know, inside Pulumi, you know, many of our customers and things. Like when we first mentioned it, they're like, "Oh, wait, what?"
Well, I don't know if you know this or not, Luke. People have strong feelings about YAML.
I know, and you know, it's interesting because it's one of these things where I think, you know, for a lot of folks, the way that they thought about, you know, what is Pulumi, especially folks who haven't really used Pulumi yet, but, you know, maybe they've just heard about it somewhere, or, you know, casually familiar with what we're doing. You know, I think a lot of folks, they think, oh, that's, you know, infrastructure as code, but with real programming languages, you know, with traditional, you know, programming languages instead of YAML or JSON or HCL or something. And I think that is, you know, to a first order approximation, that's not a bad way to think about it. That is sort of the heart of what's different, and the heart of what enables kind of the software engineering features and that sort of thing that we bring to bear. But it sort of has never been our, you know, my way at least of thinking about what we're doing. My way has really been about building the best, you know, modern infrastructure as code tool for the kind of applications that you know, we want to be able to build today. Really moving forward the state of the art for how people think about building and delivering, you know, cloud software. And I think existing programming languages gave us a whole bunch of tools for moving the bar, you know, on software engineering, on helping folks to do more, and has been great. And I think that's been something that's been important for the industry. But in the last, you know, 4 years since we launched the Pulumi open source project, you know, Pulumi has taken on a whole bunch, you know, has added value in a whole bunch of other places related to core infrastructure as code. We have native providers for being sort of the best way to work with all the major cloud platforms. We have, you know, dozens, I think now almost 90 providers for various cloud and SaaS solutions. We have a really rich infrastructure as code deployment engine. It's fast. It has, you know, a ton of rich features like, you know, secrets embedded in it and that sort of thing. And so across the board, we have a bunch of value. And now it's like, well, now let's go take all that stuff we've built and let's make it available as well to folks who may want a simpler interface to this. They may not need all those, you know, benefits you get from a kind of a software engineering approach. They may actually, you know, want a very simple single file, you know, a dozen lines of YAML. And there's a whole bunch of use cases we've seen where that is the appropriate way to interface with it, but you can still get all the value of Pulumi. And so I think that aspect was just sort of been clear in terms of how we think about, you know, what Pulumi is. I think, you know, it is a little bit of a shift and a broadening of kind of what Pulumi is for how you know, our user base and community and the ecosystem sees us. But I think you can think of it really as, you know, Pulumi now is we're trying to be a totally complete offering for infrastructure as code. Anyone trying to work with cloud infrastructure, we want Pulumi to be the best way to do that. No matter if you're, you know, working on something really small and simple and you want to use YAML, or you're working on something huge and complex and want to use, you know, Go or TypeScript or Python or Java.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking when you're talking about this, we had a stream last week. Lee Briggs was on the show, and I'll drop the link in the chat for people. But we talked a lot about when you're looking at an infrastructure as code tool, about there's the authoring experience and the execution experience, right? Like where that goes. Yep. And I think a lot of things that we're, you know, when we think about adding Java and YAML and everything, it's really enhancing that authoring experience, the experience of how you're creating it, right? Where that's going. And what you talked about really resonates with me a lot. So like I've been here at Pulumi for a little over a year, but like, as I keep saying, not everybody knows, but I talk about it enough. I feel like anybody who knows me knows this, that it took me like a year to come here. right?
Mhm.
Like I was talking to Pulumi a year before I came,
Yep.
and circumstances, whatever. But when I came around the second time to talk, and this was right before um, um, 3.0, I mean, so automation API hadn't been released, but it was part of the conversation. And I remember talking to Joe, and he was talking about it, not necessarily with that name. And to me, all of this, like, how are we creating something with Pulumi? It's not just writing some infra code that you then run, but it's like they say, how do you build this together? How do you solve this problem? How do you put these things together? That's what resonated to me, where I said, okay, this is something different. Because like you said, if it's just sort of like, okay, well, now I can write it in YAML, it's or again the same thing. Oh yeah, I mean, it's very cool that we can use general purpose programming languages that people already know, but that's a feature of the core idea,
Yeah.
right? Which is being able to compose this stuff in the way that is more than just its own isolated thing that goes and does infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it. And I think, for a lot of folks, that notion that Pulumi's the definition of what Pulumi was using traditional general purpose programming languages. For us, that was a means to an end, not an end in and of itself, right? That was one way of sort of bringing to bear a lot of that software engineering, capabilities and tools and strengths, and getting to bring all of what, already exists in the Java ecosystem or TypeScript ecosystem and get it immediately. But we knew that wasn't by itself the goal. The goal is really make it possible for everyone who wants to manage cloud infrastructure to scale up what they can build. And even if the interface you want is a simple interface like YAML, that's just going to be a dozen lines of code in a YAML file, I think even for that, you still may have complexity behind the scenes that you want to work with, right? And now I can go push that off into a component written in TypeScript, or I can go, kind of build on top of one of the components from the Pulumi registry. And so our kind of vision for what this is going to look like really includes these simple interfaces to pushing the complexity off into other places, and having, a central team managing that, or an open source community managing that, and building that up over time.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at a couple of the other things. So we had those were, I feel like, the marquee features, because they're not easy to understand, but they're good for a quick tweet, right?
Yeah.
Java, YAML. But for me, there's a couple that I'll tell you, there's one that I'm just personally very interested in, and this is someone who writes a lot of examples of Pulumi stuff. And that's crosswalk in all the languages. So for folks who don't know, we have we had this whole discussion in the open spaces earlier about crosswalk. AWS X is a collection. It's not a component. It's a component package. I'm trying to, anyway, fundamentally, it's like, what makes it a little bit easier, like, so for example, let's say you want to set up a VPC in AWS, right? And you're going to do that in, for lack of a better word, raw Pulumi, right? Or using the existing regular normal AWS provider, whether it's AWS Classic or native. There's a bunch of stuff you got to do, right? And a lot of that is fundamentally boilerplate. Like, it's just, you just do it the same way all the time, and everybody does it the same way, you sort of as a given. So crosswalk lets us like sit there and say, like, okay, these are abstraction, right? Higher level abstractions, maybe, is a way to put it, right? Like the thing, expressing good practices, standard practices, so that you can do in a couple lines of code what might take 15. So up until yesterday, this was only in TypeScript, right? And I will just say this from a perspective of somebody who was learning Pulumi a year ago, and I was like, cool, okay, well, I like to write in Go, so I'm going to look at this tutorial, which was written using AWS X, and little did I know that it wasn't going to work in Go, and going into that. So this is really cool, though, because it's applicable across, like, this, going back to the idea that, like, we don't really care what language you're writing it in, and having that experience lets you focus on the things that are specific to your problem, and not get mired down into stuff that every single person that's doing a VPC on AWS is going to do, right?
No, I think it's exactly right. And I think, this idea of, I think in infrastructure code space generally, I think the up until the last few years, really the state of the art was largely copy paste, right? It was, hey, I've got to build a VPC. Let me go search on Google for someone who's done this before. I'm going to copy paste their 500 lines of YAML or HCL over. And now if I need to change something, I'm just going to figure it out, right? And so you see these just enormous amounts of complexity, enormous amounts of reinventing the wheel, enormous amounts of sort of copy paste driven infrastructure development. And sort of we know that just, there's deep limits to how much that can scale and how robust that can be. And, when you start really worrying about security best practices and that sort of thing, like, compliance, all these things, so important to just have best practices, components off the shelf that you can use. And in most other areas of software development, that's just a given, right? You wouldn't go into your, web server code base and just start copy pasting 1,000 lines of code around, right? You'd feel dirty, right? You'd feel like you're not supposed to do that, right? You're supposed to go figure out how to refactor that into a library and go use it. And so I think this idea that, we want to build reusable abstractions is just a very simple, common kind of software engineering concept. And, it's been our goal to bring that into the cloud infrastructure space. I think when we started the project, we only supported a few languages initially. And so we kind of started off building some of these higher level components ourselves and, having customers and users of Pulumi who would go build their own components, but they'd build them in the language they're working in. So if they were a Python shop, they'd go build it in Python. If they're a Node shop, they'd go build it in TypeScript. And those were now constrained to that one language ecosystem. So you couldn't share them across, right? So the Python folks couldn't use the things built by the TypeScript people and vice versa. And when we went and built these libraries, we built them in TypeScript, and that was great because, a bunch of folks use TypeScript, but then, some people didn't. And so now they can't use them. And so I think over the last couple of years, we've put a big investment. One of the biggest, features in a sense of our launch at Pulumi 3.0 last year was sort of Pulumi packages and this ability to create reusable components in any language and share them, in the Pulumi registry. And so I think with that foundation has now given us the ability to go back to some of the libraries we've built that have been popular, that were built initially only for one language ecosystem, and now make them available to all the language ecosystems. And, last year we did that for our EKS package. We did that for our API gateway package. And then yesterday, I think for the rest of the things as part of our kind of core crosswalk for AWS. So for ECS, for load balancing, for VPC, and for a handful of other things as well.
And again, to call back to yet another episode of PulumiVision with Lee Briggs, we did one a few weeks ago where we did exactly that. Took a Pulumi package that had been written in TypeScript and then showed how to very easily turn that into all the SDKs. So, when you're creating something new from scratch now, it's not, you don't have to convert, it's a little bit of a different scenario. But you still can sit and write that in the language you prefer. And I think that stream that we did was great because it really just sort of, we've talked about it a lot. We have examples and stuff, but it was literally just a video of like Lee, we were just like, here's how you do it.
Yep.
Right. So, and that makes reusability, like you said, and sharing, because I think our ecosystem is driven by, when we think about things like, getting people to, we talk about how do we get more people to contribute open source to Pulumi. It's like, we're really generally in a scenario like this, it's not so much we'd love people to help contribute back to the core and to the provider and all that, but it's the component stuff. It's stuff like that, that they can share with other people and solve problems, like you said. So
yeah, and I think it's interesting because today, lots of folks inside, lots of users of Pulumi inside their organization are building these reusable components. They're building, abstractions that capture sort of the definition of how they want to go and configure their networking and application, and compute frameworks and data models and that sort of thing. So all that is happening inside that organization. I think, one of the things we really want to do is help folks to go take those patterns and make it really easy for them to go publish that back into open source communities, into the ecosystem, to contribute back into the libraries that we build. And so that's something that is a big area of sort of focus for us. And but we're continuing to reduce that barrier to entry to make it easier and easier and easier for folks to build these things and share them and contribute is really important.
So one of the next things, and this is one where I will freely admit, I just don't know enough about it to talk I was gonna say to speak intelligently, but even to speak unintelligently about it too much, I need to do a little more reading. So I'm gonna learn in a minute. But the AWS CDK on Pulumi, like I've read and watched and stuff, but I haven't wrapped my arms around it. And we've got someone in the chat was already very intrigued by it. So like,
yeah.
What's the story?
No, I think this is actually one of the most kind of interesting things I think that was in the launch yesterday. And I think it's a really really cool thing that we've been able to do. And just for some background for folks who kind of aren't familiar, the AWS CDK is a project that has many similar goals in a sense to Pulumi, right? It was a project built initially, all within AWS to make it possible to kind of work with, building AWS cloud infrastructure using traditional programming languages. And so also supports TypeScript and Python and Go and .NET, and lets you take, programs written in those languages and in its case, compile them down to CloudFormation, right? And so now you can go and, build your infrastructure using these traditional programming languages and using libraries that the AWS CDK provides, and then turn that into CloudFormation and deploy it kind of into AWS using CloudFormation. And so, but it has that same, we share the same kind of vision for what the future is going to look like, right? That it's going to look like engineers, using software, using programming languages to describe infrastructure and to build and use higher level abstractions over that. And so we've spent over the years talked a lot with the folks working on the AWS CDK project. And in fact, I remember showing a demo to Elad Ben Israel, who was the founder of the CDK project at reInvent like 4 years ago. Showed him a demo of something along the lines of what we shipped yesterday, where you could sort of use AWS CDK components inside Pulumi. And so we've played around with that idea a bunch of times over the years, and talked about ways we could sort of bring the projects effectively closer together, let you use some of the best of both together. And I think late last year we sort of started looking at it again, and actually found that there was some really nice ways to make it work, some improvements to both on the Pulumi side and the CDK side that made it even easier to integrate. And so we did that work earlier this year and shipped it yesterday. And the key thing it enables really is to use AWS CDK. They call what we call components, they call constructs. So to use AWS CDK constructs from within a Pulumi program. And so it means there's this library of kind of easy to use higher level abstractions for AWS specifically that have actually been built by the AWS teams. So the service teams who build the actual services themselves often go and define some higher level, frameworks for CDK for working with those things. And so there's a ton of value there, and we don't want to have to recreate all of that, and we don't want to compete with AWS on building great libraries for their platform. That's something that they're uniquely good at. We've always wanted to understand, well, how can we go take all of that stuff that is available that AWS has built and let folks use that from within Pulumi if they want to, so that they can mix and match it with the other things they're doing with Pulumi, with other clouds, with the long tail of third-party kind of SaaS and cloud providers we have, with all the rich features of the Pulumi deployment engine, just all the value of Pulumi plus all the value of this sort of set of libraries that the CDK offers. And yes, that's what we've done. We've made it so you can basically take any CDK construct and deploy it from within a Pulumi program, and you can mix and match. You can create a Pulumi resource, pass the outputs of that into a CDK construct, take the outputs of that, pass it into a Pulumi resource. Like, you can sort of do all these kind of magical things, and it's useful for both sides. For folks who primarily work with AWS CDK, it actually gives you an option where you can kind of do the same thing you're doing today, use the same, you can write the same code you're writing today, but deploy it using Pulumi instead of deploying it using CloudFormation. And so there's a lot of reasons why Pulumi might be attractive just as a deployment technology. It's faster. It has a richer set of kind of features in the Pulumi SaaS and Pulumi console. It can interoperate with other cloud environments, that sort of thing. So for pure sort of AWS CDK users, it's an interesting kind of option that they now have. And then for Pulumi users, it means that they now have access into this sort of ecosystem of additional libraries and things that they can pull in and use from Pulumi.
That's pretty awesome. I'm just poking around here too. So we had a whole bunch of new providers that got shipped. We have to go into all of them, but Oracle Cloud was sort of the big one in terms of like a whole cloud, right? But a lot of SaaS, and which is to me like a big part of this too, because like a lot of times people are like, well, why wouldn't you just use like whatever from AWS, whatever from Microsoft for Azure and stuff? And it's like, because services don't live just in the hyperscaler, right? You have PagerDuty, you have GitHub, you have Artifactory, you have, Datadog, you have all these things that go with it. And so I'm just sort of poking at some of these. I'm like, so Artifactory, that's pretty big. And Slack, I didn't even notice until I saw it on the little logo slide. I'm like, that's cool. So you can configure Slack with Pulumi. Okay. Oh, okay. Now I'm poking to see. Okay. So you can basically send notifications to Slack in a way. Well, you send messages to Slack through Pulumi. It looks like.
Yeah, I actually don't off the top of my head recall what set of resources the Slack provider offers.
It has, I'll tell you, it has conversation and user group. So you can like get conversation, get user group. So you can, but the user group, that's the one that to me, I totally see like being super helpful in this idea of I have a service I'm creating. Because it's like all the stuff you do. It's like, okay, well, we create this group in our GitHub organization for the developers of this thing. We do this thing. Yeah, we probably create a Slack group, not a channel, but like a group to notify, to tag them. That just some of these, and this is the thing. I think this is actually a good example of like sometimes it doesn't have to be huge. It's just a little thing that is part of the work that you do. Like the scope of what you can do with the Slack provider. I mean, really, how much do you need to do?
Yeah, and often it is that one or two key resources that sort of lets you kind of automate some use case that are so important. And no, I think it is actually one of the things I find just really fun is some of these SaaS providers. People really think about Pulumi and IAC as being about the big cloud providers, but there are so many of these SaaS providers that are just surprisingly valuable to be able to automate them. And once people really start thinking about those, they start thinking a little bit differently about what they can do in their automation, right? So now they can kind of use Pulumi, like you gave that example. One variant of that, we have a lot of use cases for Pulumi. When we talk to customers using Pulumi, it's very common that it's a team. Well, one use case I'd say at least is that the team is using Pulumi to sort of orchestrate some provisioning, right? So maybe when a customer comes to them, they need to stand up a new tenant for that customer, and so they're going to provision some infrastructure specific to that customer. They're going to deploy some workloads into that thing. But they may also need to hook up things in other systems, right? They may need to hook up some things in GitHub. They may need to hook up some things in Slack. They may need to hook up some things in PagerDuty. So as part of that provisioning process, there may be a whole set of things they've got to go do. And instead of putting those things all in some run book where they've got to have some user go manually do these 20 actions every time a customer onboards, they can build a piece of Pulumi software that just says, hey, here's all the things we need, and here's how they're all going to be connected to each other. And we can just do, click a button to run an automation API program, and that's going to go deploy that new tenant. And we've seen a whole bunch of customers who, have been able to like really substantially improve the level of automation for some of these things. And because of that, automating is one of those just amazing things where you can take something that would take weeks before and turn it into minutes, right? And just these incredible savings. And that changes how your product feels to your customers. That changes how your business works. Like it's a very impactful thing. And so I think some of these providers that connect through into the SaaS systems that can help with how automatable some of these workflows are really exciting. But you mentioned Oracle Cloud as well. That's another big cloud provider that the Pulumi now supports. We've had had folks asking for that for a while. It's actually it's a big provider, has a lot of surface area that they have in Oracle Cloud, and so it was actually one that took a bit of effort to kind of get on board because it's so big. But we also had started talking to the folks at Oracle more recently again about our Java support. I'm talking to our Java side of the Oracle team. And so kind of it was natural to kind of have both of those discussions as well. And I get some of their support for kind of getting this brought online. And so I think it was part of the timing for it was kind of working with them on both Java and the Oracle Cloud infrastructure. So, but no, it's really great to have that out there. We already have had some folks sharing some really cool things they've built on top of the Oracle Cloud provider.
Yeah, I just dropped a link. It's not really about those provide, but it connects. So it's a blog post I wrote last year. And you wouldn't know it as much from the title because it says it was one of my organizational patterns posts, but it's heavily inspired by like how Green Park Sports works. But they do this like where it's a kind of a good pseudocode example of when they have a service, what they do, and they have the packages that do the PagerDuty or do the Datadog and the GitHub and all the things, and it's all built within that. So, and then speaking of things you can provide, like it wasn't listed under the new SaaS providers, but it could be, is you could have thrown the Pulumi logo on that, because now you can manage your Pulumi service that way, your Pulumi organization in various ways, and which sounds like Pulumiception, but it's super accurate, super necessary, right? Like,
no, this one we've, I think like, Pulumi users are going to be the kind of folks, the folks who use the Pulumi service are going to be the kind of folks who are sort of IAC maximalists and kind of want to bring into infrastructure as code. And so we got a lot of asks for this, right? We got a lot of asks for a while, like, we in fact, we released kind of a documented REST API for the Pulumi service back late last year sometime. And the immediate thing that everyone was asking us was like, "Oh, well, great, you have that, but where's the Pulumi provider? Right? Why give us a REST API? Give us a Pulumi provider." And so that's what we ended up doing here. And it's exactly for the same reasons we were just talking about, but apply those now to the Pulumi service. There's a whole bunch of automation scenarios that folks want to do, especially like actually team management is a really fascinating one, of just like who's on what team, what are the permissions, and wanting to sort of drive that through some desired state system instead of having to ask some operator to go point and click, in the console to give the right permissions. And so there's a bunch of interesting scenarios like that. But it's actually interesting. We had, I got to do a bunch of demos in the keynote yesterday, and loved all of them. But my favorite, just because I geek out on these things, it was actually the demo of this Pulumi service provider, because it is this very Pulumiception thing. You're able to create a webhook, which gets fired every time you do an update. And so every update to the stack, which defines this webhook, actually fires the webhook, right? And so you're kind of building this program, and it's like, it's telling itself about the changes to itself. It's just a fun little kind of demo, and a really cool example of the sort of thing that is easy to do with Pulumi, and really hard actually to do with most other kind of systems.
And I think like the last, which is a little bit more plumbing, but it's sort of the crosscode thing, which I'm still sort of getting my arms wrapped around. This it's a lot of again, for lack of a better word, plumbing improvements, right? Like, and just how the engine works, how our generations work. But correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the big things about this is I can write stuff in YAML, for example, and I can dump that out into another language, and or vice versa. Because so like, this is like the Lee Briggs appreciation show. I decided. I don't know. Did you see Lee's post yesterday? He wrote this blog about deploying Kubernetes in ridiculous languages like Fortran and everything, and it's because that can generate JSON, which goes into that, and then basically you could write a program in Fortran that would deploy your Kubernetes cluster, which don't do this, but but you can, which is kind of the thing. But like, what are some of the stuff around that? What are some of the stuff? I swear I speak for a living.
No, yes, I think crosscode is interesting, because it's something that wasn't per se something we launched yesterday, but it was something that we're kind of giving a name to an underlying piece of technology that's been available for a while, and that with the launches yesterday is an even more kind of critical component of what we're doing. And so I think the key way to think about crosscode is it's a set of technologies that we use under the hood to sort of support this multi-language, multi-cloud strategy that we kind of have in terms of the core of Pulumi. And so it's, if you really think about it from the perspective of kind of us building Pulumi, it's a few things. One, it's something we call Pulumi schema, which is the sort of language neutral way of describing the surface area for a piece of, a cloud infrastructure library, whether that's a cloud provider or a component package or whatever it is. It's just a language neutral way of describing what one of these things is. And we for everything in the Pulumi registry, for example, it comes with a Pulumi schema that describes it. And that's one of the core pieces of crosscode. We then support, SDK generators, so the ability to go take, that schema and turn it into a library in any of our supported languages. So now for any package that's in the registry, we can go say, well, here's the way that you use that from Java, or here's the way you use that from YAML, or here's the way you use that from TypeScript. And then we have, documentation generation. So a way to turn the schema into rich API documentation for the Pulumi resource model. And so that's what you see when you go into, the Pulumi registry, for example. You see all this rich API documentation for tens of thousands of APIs. That's all generated through that cross-code docs generator. And the last one, which is sort of where some of the interesting new capabilities we've talked about recently come about, is we actually have this technology that we sort of we call Pulumi configuration language, but it's really an intermediate language that is sort of a representation that users don't interact with directly, but that is a kind of representation of Pulumi programs, but sort of as an abstract representation that you won't use directly. But we have the ability to convert things from a whole bunch of other places into this Pulumi configuration language, and then turn Pulumi configuration language into any supported Pulumi language. And so, for example, we support the ability to turn things from, we have a TF to Pulumi tool, right, which lets you turn Terraform code into PCL and then into any of our Pulumi languages. We have ARM to Pulumi and Kube to Pulumi and a whole bunch of other conversion tools. We have Pulumi import, which lets you point at some existing cloud infrastructure and say, I would like to bring that into Pulumi, and I'm going to get some code for that. And so that also sits on top of the same technology. And then most recently, with the launches yesterday, as part of our YAML launch, we kind of knew one of the things that we've seen with every other kind of approach to kind of a YAML or simple DSL for cloud infrastructure is that you just hit a limit, right? At some point, it gets too big, it gets too complicated, but you've already bet on that tool, and so you kind of get stuck, right? You've got this complexity, you don't know what to do, you don't want to move to another tool because it's going to be very disruptive. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure as part of us introducing a tool like YAML was that we always had an easy way for you to, to go on the off ramp, right? If the complexity is large and you want to use Python, you want to use TypeScript, want to make that really, really easy. And so that's, the Pulumi convert command that we added, which sits on top of the same technology, the same PCL, the same everything we've built to kind of convert between other languages and other systems. Now all of that's available to go convert Pulumi YAML into other languages, and you can do that. You can take your existing infrastructure, your production deployment could be deployed with YAML, and now you're like, oh, I want to start managing with TypeScript. You just run one command, hit PulumiUP, nothing changes, and now you can start adding features and continue evolving it from there. So really, really easy to sit on top of that. But crosscode really is just the thing that powers all of that. It's those core pieces of technology around schema, code generation, and this intermediate language.
That's awesome. I'm just saying in the chat there was some conversation about creating a provider and stuff. So it's definitely not a thing to do like over your lunch break or anything necessarily, but I feel like our documentation in that guide, I put it in the link in the chat, has definitely made things a little bit easier as that goes. But hopefully we just want to continue to like improve that authoring experience, and I think it's come a long way. Let's see, are there any other so folks in the let's see. Oh yeah, so Marcel says the YAML runtime is the strawberry on the cake because of the convert argument. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And it really does change the way that people sort of reason about that. Okay, so I'd love to see a provider for the Stripe API. Interesting.
Yeah. No, I don't think we have one today. No, I think it's yeah.
I'm just curious if you so Enron who chatted, if you you don't have to justify yourself to me ever, but I'm curious about where would you do that? Like I always go through and someone's like, I want to have this thing, and I'm like, what are you doing? Not that I think you're doing something sketchy, but I'm just like, how do you test YAML code?
Yeah, so it is one of the things that there's a lot of kind of core software engineering things that are going to be a little bit less rich in terms of your capabilities there. Like hey, we don't have for loops, we don't have if statements, we don't have built-in unit testing frameworks, we don't have built-in we don't have any ability to sort of build reusable components today, which is directly inside the YAML support. So one of our goals has really been for the YAML support to be the very opposite end of the spectrum from where our languages are today, to be sort of the simplest sort of feature limited kind of thing in terms of software engineering, but to give you that ability to convert if you do need those features. That said, there are a bunch of testing techniques that we see people use a lot. We use them internally a lot for for Pulumi programs that you can use actually with the YAML support. So in fact, if you go, I'll pull up a link here and show you. Find one of these. Oh, I guess we actually do it a slightly different way inside the repo, but we have this as a test framework that we use, but it's also a lot of customers use it as well. That lets you basically take any Pulumi stack written in any language, and it's a Go-based test framework, and so you kind of write the tests in Go, but you can use it with any Pulumi language, and it runs a Pulumi stack, a Pulumi program, through sort of a life cycle where it, provides some configuration, stands up the stack, maybe makes some deltas to what is deployed in the stack to kind of go through a life cycle of changes you might have made to get there, then runs some runtime validation against it. So it goes, takes the outputs of the stack, and maybe if the stack was supposed to stand up a database, it goes and tests that it can connect to the database and run some queries against the database.
Is this, hang on, let me begin this.
Yeah, the integration testing framework, exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
so I'll drop the link to this in the chat. I'm actually curious because this came up in the open spaces today at Community Summit about this running integration tests, and so while this test is written in Go, this can still, it doesn't live in your Pulumi program though. You sort of have to call it right somewhere else, or
no, this is just, you can use Go test. You can drop this one file. In fact, we use this in a lot of places where we don't have any other Go code. We just kind of have a
it'll work. So this could be sitting in next to my index.ts, and then I have my test file and run Go test inside of that same. So that's actually something. Okay, so I'm note to self. This,
I've seen people build versions of this kind of library.
Documentation could be updated because that is not clear. Yeah. I feel like, but you also can do the example that's given on this page too, is you can use the automation API to write these integration tests as well, which would again help you, like, even though because what you're writing in the automation API is not necessarily testing the code because it's an integration test, right? It's testing the outcome, right?
In fact, what the test framework that I mentioned there is implemented in Go, the one that we use. That one, it was built way long before we had automation API. And in fact, in some sense, automation API, one of the motivating use cases for automation API was this integration testing framework we built. But you could build something very much like it, on automation API, right? It does the same sort of thing automation API does. It does, does PulumiUP, it gets the Pulumi stack outputs. It sort of runs a Pulumi stack through a bunch of the same sorts of things you would do with automation API. So automation API makes it really easy to build frameworks like this.
So this is a perfect example. I'm looking at this repo here of exactly what we just talked about. So sorry, I know this is not, this is, I'm learning. I hope everybody else is too. So yeah, in this case, so this is, I mean, I don't know what your Pulumi program might look like, but yeah, the program.
I think the program is just a Pulumi program. Yeah,
is the Pulumi program. Case, right? And then here you've got the tests. So
yeah, that's really it, right? It's just
so how would I? Okay. There's nothing to do with PulumiUP anymore, although it's connected because we talked about this in the open spaces. So if I was going to structure this inside my regular Pulumi program, like, so I've got my repo, and the root of that repo is my index is this program file. So do I have to, like, how do I do these things together? Like, what is this? Because this is not like how you would structure your Pulumi program, though, right? Because this is the root, the program file folder, right?
Yeah. So, well, I can show you. I mean, you can do it sort of however you want, but one example, maybe if I can share my screen and show you.
Of course. Yeah.
So yeah, this this right
you
here.
You might need to embiggen a little bit if you can. Command plus should. There you go.
Yeah. So this this is just our examples repo, actually, just pulumi.com, github.com/pulumi/example. So just has this is not about testing or anything. This is just about having dozens and dozens and dozens of of examples for using Pulumi. But one of the things that we have, we obviously want to test our examples, right? We want to make sure that our examples all kind of work correctly. And so we, on every commit into this repo, we run a huge battery of tests. And so in this MISC folder, there's this test folder, and it has exactly the same sort of things you were just showing, right? These are all these tests, and we have a few separate ones just so that we can run subsets of the tests. We can run just the AWS tests, for example. And each one of these tests is just a really simple thing, right? It just says, I want to run, this test, this AWS Go EKS folder up in here. And I want to run, this is the validation I want to do, after I stand up that stack, I want to verify that the result was that it stood up something with an HTTP endpoint that I can reach from the internet, right? And so there's just, each one of these tests is really simple, but they automate a whole bunch of standing up infrastructure, validating it, tearing it all down. And so we run these tests, many times a day. We're running thousands of these tests against our cloud infrastructure and standing up all this infrastructure for a minute and tearing it all down. And it provides that all that automation provides a ton of assurances that, kind of these examples are going to continue to work, or that my components are going to continue to do what I want.
Now that I looked at the test, I understand that way to answer my questions, because there's part of there's basically the thing that's pointing to the Pulumi program.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's just a path, right? So like if you put your test folder inside your program, you're just going to say bop up, /.
Yep.
Or actually, or what? Yeah. Okay. So this is okay. So see, today I learned, and I feel like I'm going to need to do maybe we'll do a whole other stream about this sometime.
I think testing for infrastructure as code is one of these just like super important. I think, people, there's such a desire to bring more confidence into the infrastructure development and deployment process, and testing, just like it is in other areas, is one of the great tools you can bring to bear on that. And I actually think, unit testing, which you can do in language, is really valuable, but it can't give you the same guarantees because you're not actually deploying the infrastructure, right? You're just validating that sort of the wiring right between things. These integration tests are a great way to really validate end to end that the thing works as it says it's going to work.
It's funny, and again, we talked about this a little bit in the summit when we were talking about. We got into a conversation about testing, because always, and it's one of the things I remember. And I'll give this example here again. And this was always something that came up with Chef. So Chef had a unit testing framework that was called Chef spec, because it was basically our spec. And so people would write unit tests, but your unit test should not be testing Pulumi or testing, like, you don't write a test to make sure that .NET works, right? It's your logic. So an example would be, that was my Chef example, and I'll think of a Pulumi example in a minute, was, let's say you had a line of code to install Nginx. And so the Chef, the program, all it is package Nginx. And then someone would write a unit test that would be like, did package get installed? Would this install the package called Nginx? Well, of course it would, because that's literally what that line does. Now, when you need the test is, let's say you're going to install Apache, where you have a conditional, which is if Ubuntu, then the package name is this. If CentOS, package name that. That's a thing to test, because you're testing your logic. Sure. So the same thing, if you're going to unit test your Pulumi code, you're testing because you have some kind of logic in there to say do things a certain way. But if you are seriously, like, for example, if you had a Pulumi program that was create a VPC and everything was hard coded in it, you don't need to write a unit test for that, because Pulumi will do what you said. What you're sort of wanting to test is, did Pulumi do what you meant? That's how I used to say unit test. There wasn't, did the thing do what you said? It's, did it do what you meant?
Yeah.
And then again, to Luke's point, the advantage of unit tests is they're very fast. They're good for testing your business logic, so to speak. Yep. But that's not enough, right? It'll get you started. And also, I will say, this is me dusting off my old InfraCode tester. While unit tests are nice and fast, they're probably this is the opposite of writing regular code, I guess. They're almost the least important. Like, they're nice to have, right? Like in certain places, but get better coverage, quote coverage. That's another thing we can fight about. I think on your integration side, first, maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think both are really valuable, and I think it's almost always important, at every kind of layer of software development to kind of have a mix of both kind of categories. If you only focus on integration tests, it can get relatively heavy weight, right? And so those tests, you're not going to be able to have as many of them. They're not going to be able to probe for as many different combinations of the kind of configuration space. But they're going to be able to really validate that the thing properly works. And so I think that a mix is always good. I think it's one of the great things with Pulumi. It is easy to have that mix of those two levels.
Awesome. Looking back at some of the questions that came up. Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. Matt says, Stripe idea. You could a cool use case for starting or stopping billing for a single tenant deployment, right? You could, as part of when you're bringing up the infrastructure for it, charge for it or so. These are all the things. This is the cool thing about doing this kind of work, is you get to see all the really interesting problems that people have and the really clever things they do with it. And I'm sure, creating something like Pulumi and being as involved, I'm sure it's got to be fascinating for you to be like, wow, we didn't even think someone would want to do this with that. And look at that cool thing they did.
No, I think it's one of the fun things about working in the kind of developer tools and infrastructure kind of spaces is that, you're sort of building these tools that folks are using to go out and build cool things on top of it. And so, I think you're always kind of learning. But I think it's particularly true with something like Pulumi, where it's just very horizontal, right? We kind of support a ton of different clouds, a ton of different cloud architectures, a ton of different languages. And so we kind of build it in that building block, very horizontal kind of way, and kind of let folks build cool things on top. And there's a lot of similarities across a lot of things that people build, but I'm constantly seeing things that are like, wow, that's a really cool application of those ideas. I had no idea, and so I think learning from that and seeing where I can help other folks to kind of go and benefit from those same things.
So I'm going to ask you a question along those lines, because you've been. What's the weirdest thing you've seen somebody do with Pulumi? And you can use weird, interpret that however you want. It can be, doesn't necessarily mean bad, or just like the thing that made you go, huh.
It's a good question. I'm sure I have a good answer. There's nothing coming to mind that is completely completely shocking. Yeah, no, nothing comes to mind that's completely shocking. But it's seeing people do things like where they're managing just like files on their file system as part of automating into other systems. They're just having Pulumi programs that write files to disk and things like that. It's I would have never thought of the idea of kind of using infrastructure as code to manage files on your machine. But hey, you can do it, and there are use cases where that could make sense. But things like automation API are, I feel like, really the things that have unlocked kind of the most creativity in a sense, because with Pulumi, just the CLI entry point, there's a lot of different things you can model, but the workflow is always going to be kind of the same, right? It's always going to be that you go run PulumiUP, right, to deploy some stuff. But with automation API, it starts to sort of let you plug Pulumi into all sorts of interesting new use cases. And so some of these self-service provisioning things, some of these, provisioning customer workloads for kind of SaaS companies, there's a whole bunch of cool things that I've seen built on top of that.
Awesome. I'm very excited about the things that people are going to build. So when you're doing, if you think your use case for Pulumi is weird, tweet at us and let us know. And the person with the weirdest use case will maybe get some swag or maybe not. I will not commit to anything, but you will get Twitter engagement. I can promise you that. How about that? Awesome. Well, that's kind of bringing us to the end here. Any other kind of final thoughts you have, Luke, about looking back at where we've been, where we're going?
Yeah, no, I think it's it's interesting. The set of launches, it's been exciting to kind of get them out there, and been working on them for a little while. And I think I was kind of mentioning to some folks, for me, actually, this set of kind of releases as part of yesterday's launches, actually some of the most kind of important new things we've done in the Pulumi platform, I think, since the original launch of the platform. And I think in terms of how we think about kind of what Pulumi is and how it can integrate into the rest of the sort of infrastructure as code market and who it can support and that sort of thing. I think this is really trying to open up, access to Pulumi as really being, the best option for infrastructure as code for anyone who is trying to work with the cloud. And I think that, today's the starting point for that, with sort of the YAML support, with the CDK integration, with a whole bunch of the things we're doing here. But I think it's there's so much more we still want to do. I think we're continuing to sort of innovate and invent and improve on core infrastructure as code ideas. We're continuing to bring those ideas to more and more different audiences, and so I'm excited to keep working on that. I think we think that the world of how we build and deliver infrastructure to the cloud is going to look a lot different in a few years than it did a few years ago, and we're kind of excited to be working on that.
Fantastic. I'm excited to be a part of it. So as whatever platform you're watching us on, YouTube, Twitch, whatever, smash the subscribe or follow or whatever the button is so you'll know when we've got new streams. We will not have a PulumiVision next week because I will be on an airplane going to KubeCon. But the following Friday, so 2 weeks from tomorrow, Fridays are our usual PulumiVision days, we will be doing PulumiVision live from KubeCon, and which will probably be, if my math is right, means I will be doing it very early in the morning, I think. Or no, do I do that backwards? Actually, I need to look at it and make sure it's not during my talk. But whatever. It will be 2 weeks from tomorrow. And if you're going to be at KubeCon, make sure you come and stop by and all that. But Luke, thanks for joining me on PulumiVision. Everybody, thanks for joining, and we will see you